Hey everyone, we are only a week away from the end of our course. This is week 14 of our 15-week semester here at UHWO. And I don't know about you, but I am also eager to have online learning end soon. I know it's not going to necessarily end for the fall, but I don't know, I want it to end soon. With that said, as most of you know, I'm also teaching this same course at Manoa. I, generally speaking, like to treat each of you, each of these sections the same. But when it comes to making this study video, although your exams are different in terms of the material and even the questions asked, the general study principles of how you prepare for it are the same. So what I'm doing here is I'm making this shorter video right now that applies specifically to all of you at West Oahu, and then you're going to have the rest of the video I prepared for the Manoa students. That would be how they prepare for the exam in general, since that part, how to prepare for the exam, is the same. Again, I'm not trying to like lump you all together. It just saves me, as you're going to see with the other video, it's 25 minutes long. I just don't have to make the same video 2 times, which I'm hoping you can appreciate. Our exam, to review for us here, is worth 30%. And so because it is worth 30%, because it matters more, because it's 50% larger in weight than your first exam, right? And because many of you are relying for a really good third exam to like really make your final grade look better, the way I structure the exam is kind of like, it is comprehensive exam, but it's not that much more, as you're going to see in the study and prepare video that goes along with this. Here's what I want you to do, and I'm going to be repeating myself from what I'm going to say here, what I say in the other video, but the way I want you to prepare for this is I want you to prepare for the third exam like it's a third exam, and then just add to it a review of the first and second exams. So what I did is I went into MindTap and did a Cengage thing, and I opened up the first exam and the second exam for you to review all of the questions and all of the answers and why certain things were right and wrong. I want you to review those all because that's going to help you prepare for the exam. Now the exam is going to be in 2 parts. It's going to have multiple choice questions, and it's going to have short answer questions. So let me, even though you're going to see this again, let me just show you it. So here, first, you're going to see kind of a folder like you saw before, but in this part 1 of the exam, you're going to have an hour and 40 minutes. It's going to be just like what you've seen before for exam 1 and exam 2, except this is going to have about 60 multiple choice questions. You're going to have 100 minutes total to do those 60 questions. About 30 of those 60 questions are going to be about the material from part 3 of this course. That would be chapter 16, 17, 20, 21, and 22. And then the other, and so that works out to be about 6 to 7 multiple choice questions per chapter. Then the other remaining 30 multiple choice questions are going to be about parts 1 and 2 total. So that means that there'd be about 2 to 3 multiple choice questions per chapter. So you really don't need to obsess over all of the chapters equally. You should study you should study the last 5 chapters and then just kind of briefly review the first 10 chapters of this course. So that is the multiple choice questions. Then what you're going to see here is you're going to see another thing. It's basically going to be called Part 2. Let's see if it makes it here. I don't know, it's so unhappy. Oh, here we go. So you're going to see something here called Part 2 of 2. And so you're going to see that appear over here. It's only going to consist of 3 questions, 3 multiple choice questions. The multiple choice question portion of the exam is going to have 60 total questions, and they're going to be worth 100 points. These 3 short answer questions, you will have 45 minutes to complete those. You can take it at a completely different time as the multiple choice questions. You can do it first, you can do it second. I don't care which order you do it in, but it still has to be completed in that same window of time, which I'll talk about. It's going to consist of 3 questions. 1 question is going to be about supply and demand, which would be from part 1 of this course. The second question is going to deal with either GDP, inflation, or unemployment. So it's going to deal with one of those 3 statistics. And then the third question is going to be about monetary policy. I am not going to ask you to graph anything. I am not going to ask you to calculate anything. You are going to be writing. Each of those questions will be weighted equally, more or less, and they're going to be worth somewhere between 10 to 15 points each. So that would mean, and I haven't determined it exactly, so that would mean that it's going to be somewhere between 30 to 45 points total. So that would mean that the multiple choice, if it's worth 100 points, this second part is actually pretty important as well. And the design of it is because I do think that some of you do know the material well. It's just that you don't do multiple choice questions as well. And so this is designed to help those of you students really show what you know how to do. Let's talk about the window of time that you have to do this exam. You're going to have from May 3rd to the 5th to do the exam. It'll be available from midnight starting of May 3rd all the way to 11:59 on May the 5th. So you'll have a 48-hour window to complete it. At that point, you would also need to have the homework assignments completed by that May 5th date. Okay, so as you now, this will segue then to the other video that I made for the Manoa students about how do you study for the exam. Watch that. You can kind of ignore the beginning part when I tell them what they need to do. Keep in mind as well that your questions are different. And I don't want you to think, well, you know, this isn't about rigor. It's not even about... it's not about the complexity of the questions, and I don't want anyone to ever think that. I mean, honestly, I think that the West Oahu material I've developed is about equally as difficult as the Manoa course, and so some of you might think I'm too tough, but yeah, you get some free knowledge. No, it's really because at Manoa, many students do take the course to prepare for the business school, but by the time they take it, they're not usually accepted into the business school. So there is a bit of a sorting, right? It helps students determine whether they're going to get accepted into the business school. But also because there's actually a sizable number of students that are actually going to be straight economics majors. That's very different in West Oahu, where practically all of you are business students. I know not all of you, but most of you are business students who are just taking these 2 courses, Econ 130 and 131, because your business degree requires it. That doesn't mean I'm less rigorous. It just means I'm not trying to prepare future economists. nor am I trying to steer people away from the business degree, because in this case you don't have to apply to be admitted to the business school. Okay, so I hope that helps you understand what the exam is going to be about. Now watch the next video that's going to talk about how do you prepare for the exam, and then be on the lookout for next week. I am making 3 videos. One that reviews the material from part 1 of this course, one that reviews the material from part 2 of this course, and one that reviews the material from part 3 of this course. Okay, we are coming to the end of a long academic year of distance learning. I think we can all say that. With that said, we are getting to the point of the 3rd exam. So let me talk a little bit about what that exam is going to entail, how it's going to be a little bit different than the first 2 exams, and that's largely because of the weight of this 3rd exam. And then we'll talk about the material it will cover, and then finally how to prepare for it. So let's start first with a review of how much this 3rd and last exam counts for. As we see here in the syllabus, the 3rd exam does count for 30% of your exam grade. At that point, when you are completing the 3rd exam, you would also have the assignments due and the news article analyses due, all at around that same time. So again, it's kind of like before, where you've got a bunch of things all due at the same time. So prepare appropriately. And then skipping ahead here to when the exam will be. It will be, you'll have a May 5th to the 7th in which to complete it. So you'll have a, I won't make it noon. I'll do as I did before, 11:59 p.m. so that you have a 48-hour time period in which to complete it. Now, this 3rd exam, because it is worth 30% of your grade, it's going to cover more material, but it's going to cover more material, I hope, in a fair way. So let's talk about how it's going to do that. The most important thing I'll say here is that the exam, the focus of the exam, the focus is the chapters that you have not yet been tested on. So that would be chapters 16, 17, 20, 21, and 22. If you remember, 23 is not on the exam. If you do the homework, that is extra credit. So it's going to cover just, for the new material, it's going to cover 16, 17, 20, 21, and 22. And so when you see the multiple choice questions, that's going to be about half of the exam questions. The multiple choice questions are going to be on those untested chapters. So if we do the rough math here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, if my memory serves me correctly, that would be an average of about 6 to 7 multiple choice questions per chapter. Okay, now there's another about 30 multiple choice questions. And I say I sound a little bit vague here, but that's because I'm just trying to finalize up what the exam is going to look like. And I make it in stages, and I either go between being too long of an exam to too short of an exam, and I keep fine-tuning it. But right now, it's designed as having about 30 multiple choice questions on the new material. That's 16, 17, 20, 21, and 22. And then another 30 multiple choice questions on all of the previous chapters. So that would be chapters 1, 2, 3, 9, and 4. and 10, 11, 15, 12, and 13. So that's about 10 chapters. I shouldn't say about, that is 10 chapters. And so the net result of the math is that you should expect to see about 2 to 3 multiple choice questions on the previous chapters. Now, that would mean that in total this exam is covering 15 chapters. But I really want you to focus, even though it is a comprehensive exam, I want you to focus your attention on the last 5 chapters, because that's going to be half of the multiple choice questions. Now, what I have done at this point is that if you go into Cengage, you go into MindTap, you will be able to see what your previous exam questions and answers are and why you got certain things wrong. There may be some points where I asked the question asked previously that I asked it again. That isn't going to be the norm, but they're certainly not going to be that entirely different from what you've been asked before. The way that these multiple choice questions are made, just so that everyone kind of has a good idea of how they're made, is that, as many of you probably know, authors of textbooks give multiple choice questions to instructors, and they're useful somewhat, and sometimes I think they're well written, but I don't think that sometimes I think they can get a little bit too nitpicky. I think they can get a little bit too precise, and plus additionally, they are obviously a little bit more predictable. So I try to get inspiration from the questions that are made to make my own questions. Sometimes if I think the authors of the textbook have a good question, I'll use that question as well. And so I combine those to make these exams. But again, with that said, 5 chapters are going to have 6 to 7 multiple choice questions. And 10 chapters are going to have about 2 to 3 multiple choice questions per chapter. And then, in addition, and so now this, hopefully you've been paying attention here to what I'm saying here. So as you can see here, when I'm making the exam, I kind of make it, this is kind of exciting. You get to see how I make it. And so you can see here when I've made it, I usually make it in this kind of like side program, and then I import it over here. And the problem with asking things this way is it links it to just being multiple choice questions. So what I've done as well is I've created a second part to this exam. And that second part to this exam is going to consist of, let me see if I can find it here. Sorry, it's going to be in my other course here. 1 second. I don't know. We can kind of see it here, and I'll be importing it over. So you're going to see a third, exam 3. You're going to see a new kind of module here. This is where you're going to see the exam. Now you're not going to see this stuff here. You don't have to worry about that. But I'm going to give you, as you can see here, I'm going to give you 45 minutes to write answers to 3 short answer questions. You should be typing them out. Those 3 short answer questions, there'll be 1 question about part 1 of the material, 1 about part 2 of the material, 1 about part 3 of the material. I do not expect that you will be busily typing for 45 minutes. I don't think it's going to require that long. With there only being 3 questions, you should have enough time to think about your answer and then type it out. And so trying to see here. Oh, this is for the other section of the course, but if we just go over here, you'll see here then that I've made it where it's exam 3 comprehensive, part 1 of 2, the other one being part 2 of 2. And you'll see here at this point I'm giving you 100 minutes to do about 60 multiple choice questions. I might change this a little bit. I never want people to run out of time, but I don't want people to have so much time that they second and third guess themselves and get something wrong. But right now, as it's set, you're going to have about 100 minutes to do 60 multiple choice questions. Then you can take a big long break. You can do whatever you want, and then later you would have 45 minutes to do 3 short answer questions. You can do things in whatever order you want. It's just once you start it, you have to finish it. So, prepare yourself for that, for having to do things in that kind of way. Now, with that said, let's go back over here. And now let's start talking about each of these chapters. And what I'm going to do here is, since I'm not like writing things out and I'm just talking about things, I think it's a little easier because then I can just focus on my words, and it's nice too because I can, now having looked at the exam, I can kind of just focus on how I understand it to be. So let's just start with chapter 1, and I'm going to talk about each of these chapters in turn. Let's start with chapter 1, 10 Principles of Economics. Well, part of this is pretty easy. There are 10 things that make economists who they are and make the discipline like it is. I mean, this is both chapter 1 and chapter 2. And so you can think of chapter 1 and 2 as being very basic introductory material. My suggestion would be is that as we go through each of these chapters, you would have your notes in front of you for the exam, that you write down, 5 or 10 bullet points for each chapter, and that should be probably sufficient enough to probably help you go quickly through the multiple choice questions. And obviously with number 1, you should have 10 bullet points for each of the 10 principles. For chapter 2, for thinking like an economist, there it's key concepts like opportunity cost. It would be key concepts like thinking on the margins. It would also be key concepts like the idea of scarcity. And pretty much any question you're going to see in multiple choice question you're going to see from those first 3 chapters is going to deal with the things I've just talked about. The real technical parts of this course and really started with our discussion of international trade. And in chapter 3, what we are talking about here is, do you know concepts like absolute advantage and comparative advantage? Do you know how to calculate comparative advantage and the idea of the opportunity cost that each country faces when producing 2 different goods? And you're not going to have to necessarily graph anything out because it is a multiple choice question that you would be experiencing, but you could expect some very simple mathematics of calculating a comparative advantage. And then we get to chapter 4. And chapter 4, at the time, was the most difficult stuff, although now it probably seems a lot simpler. But it was in chapter 4 where we saw notions of supply and demand. Do you know how to define demand? Do you know how to define supply? And in doing that, can you understand the difference between moving along the curve versus shifting the curve? And how do we understand those two curves as getting us to an equilibrium? And what causes the market to go to always be going towards that equilibrium? And then when one of the curves or both of the curves shift, how does that adjust the equilibrium? And then that chapter sort of concludes with why things like price controls, price floors, and price ceilings are generally a bad idea. If we are talking about the short answer questions, of those 5 chapters, I am going to focus on the most important thing. It's probably going to deal with chapter 4. And it's going to be, not everyone's going to have the same questions, but it's probably going to deal with some aspect of supply, demand, or comparative statics, which again is that idea that the equilibrium changes as you shift one or both of the curves. So for the short answer, you really only have to focus your attention. I'm fine guaranteeing it to you that it's going to be about chapter 4 for the short answer. Okay. Now, let's talk about the second part of this course. The second part of this course was all about measuring for the most part. And in chapter 10, we focused on how do you measure the size of the economy, meaning how do we calculate GDP? What is GDP? What is nominal GDP? What is real GDP? What is the GDP deflator? How does the way that we measure GDP, how does it get things accurate, and how does it get things mismeasured? How is it not accurate when it's measuring something? For the multiple choice questions, you could expect to see questions like me giving you an event and asking you, is that part of GDP or not? Me giving you some numbers for, let's say, the nominal and the real GDP, and you having to tell me what the GDP deflator is. Me giving you some numbers, and you having to know how to calculate the nominal GDP, or even how to calculate the real GDP. But it won't be anything that you haven't seen before. Then in chapter 11, we get to this idea of how do we measure changes in prices. So here it would be all about how do you calculate the consumer price index? What does the consumer price index miss when it measures things? What is its, how do things like the substitution bias alter what the numbers should look like? And concluding, why is it important that we measure inflation? What is it that knowing inflation should tell us about the economy? And then in chapter 15, we looked at unemployment. And when we looked at unemployment, here it was a discussion of how do we calculate what the unemployment rate is? How do we add up all the components of unemployment? How is the unemployment rate different than the discouraged worker? How do things like cyclical unemployment add into natural unemployment to equal the actual unemployment? How does structural unemployment and frictional unemployment add up to natural unemployment? Then, in chapter 12, we got to a notion of production and growth. And we basically were looking at how do economies grow? What is it that they need in order to be able to grow? That they, in general, these economies need some notion of property rights. They need some notion of production being encouraged by the savings and financial system, which came from chapter 13. Now, within these 5 chapters, when we get to talking about the short answer questions, it's going to be about chapters 10, 11, and 15. It's going to be on one of these 3 measurements, and it's going to be a question just about one of the 3. I'm generally speaking not going to be forcing you to do math because in the short answer questions, because you are typing things out. Same goes for graphs. I'm not going to have you graphing things in the short answer questions. You're going to be typing things out. So that would not be a point where you have to worry about doing those kinds of things. Then we get to the last 5 chapters. So let's start with the monetary system. Here it was all about the Federal Reserve and the role that the fractional reserve banking system has in growing the economy. Now, given that you're going to have 6 to 7 questions on each of these chapters, here you will expect to see a little bit more detail. And so now for this part, so whereas for the first 10 chapters, I don't think you need to re-go through each of the chapters. I would just review the first 2 exams, quite frankly. Review your notes very briefly, again, with the idea that for each chapter you make 5 to 10 bullet points of the key ideas. Review the old exams, and I think you'll be okay. Even during the exam, I think it lets you do it. You could have the old exams open at the same time as you have the third exam open, and you could use that to help you work through it as well. Then, for again, these 5 chapters, you have a little bit more detail. Also, you don't have an exam to sort of rely on. So for this part, you would kind of study for it like you would a traditional exam. You could do that kind of A+ review thing of how to prepare for the exam. But again, for chapter 16, you would expect to see some details about the fractional reserve banking system and the Federal Reserve. For chapter 17, you would see that the primary concern of how you control the money supply is all about inflation and why monetary authorities need to be concerned about how money supply grows because it can contribute to inflation. Then in chapter 20, you would see probably as one of chapters 20 and 21 are the more difficult chapters. And these chapters deal with overall equilibrium in the economy. And so because they're dealing with overall equilibrium in the economy, we need to talk about how does the economy, if the economy is pushed out of equilibrium, how does it go back into equilibrium? And what chapter 21 was all dealing with was how do monetary and fiscal authorities help push it to equilibrium a little bit faster. And then the course basically concludes with that discussion of inflation and unemployment and the inverse relationship between the two. Now, the short answer for this one is a little bit more difficult, but I wanted to make your life, even though you might think, wow, Shedding, you're Class is already very difficult. I don't know why you think you're always being kind, because you're a real difficult person. But I'm going to tell you right now that that the short answer question is going to really focus on chapter 16. So I'd like you to focus on chapter 16, Theory of Money and the Structure of the Banking System, for the short answer question. That will at least help you focus your studying for the part 2 of the exam. As it works out before, I don't want you to dismiss either parts of this exam. As it stands right now, the multiple choice questions, there are 60 multiple choice questions, and it would be worth about 100 points or so. And the short answer, each of the short answer questions are going to be worth anywhere between 10 to 15 points each. So that would mean that you're looking at 30 to 45 points total. So that's pretty sizable, right? Because if you consider, then the multiple choice questions are 100 points. The short answer are about, I don't know, again, it's going to be somewhere between 30 and 45 points. So don't dismiss the short answer questions just because we haven't done them before. It's actually designed, the reason why I'm doing the short answer questions is because I think there are a number of you who are really putting in the time into this course, except you're getting tripped up by multiple choice questions, which unfortunately, because of the nature of this distance course, we're kind of stuck using. But I'm going to try to fix that with these these short answer questions that obviously I will manually grade. Okay. So consider this the first studying video. What that means is that next week, in further preparation for the exam, I'm going to make one video that reviews the material from part 1 of this course, one that reviews the material from part 2 of this course, and then a final one that reviews the material from part 3 of this course. So next week, in the ensuing days, you'll have 3 videos from me. And then in the week after that, you would have the exam. Okay?